Welcome to Plastisphere, the podcast on plastics, people, and the planet. My name is Anja. You've probably heard of bioplastics, these new kinds of plastics that are marketed as environmentally friendly. If you've been following my show, you might know the episode in which I tried to better understand this group of materials and the confusion around it. I'm making a plastic podcast, and this episode is on bioplastics. And I wanted to find out what people think about bioplastics.
I think bioplastic is a good way to decrease the pollution in our world today. But I don't know if the price is affordable.
Unfortunately, in this world we live in, you can't get away from plastic. And so anything that makes it biodegradable is a much better solution.
Bio-based and biodegradable? I don't think I know too much of the difference between those.
I don't know, I guess I'm still skeptical about biodegradable plastic. Anything that's plastic to me, I'm still thinking this is still nearly impossible. And people also have to do the right things with it. That, to me, I think is the biggest limitation. But, if I have a choice between biodegradable plastic and normal plastic, I'll, still take their word for it and try it out.
After speaking to several experts from science, industry, and NGOs, I came away with the conclusion that bioplastics have their own issues and that they won't be a silver bullet for solving plastic pollution. That was 5 years ago. Since then, things have developed, and I've repeatedly heard about one material in specific that people put a lot of hope in: PHA, short for polyhydroxyalkanoates, another one of those hard-to-pronounce materials. The interesting thing is that PHAs are made by bacteria, but I only covered them shortly in my previous episode. Now, the people over at the Indisposable Podcast just posted an episode that looks at this in greater detail. If you don't know their podcast yet, do check it out. The Indisposable Podcast is produced by Upstream, a change agency in the US that works on the transition from the throwaway economy to one that is regenerative, circular, and equitable. They had Lisa Erdl on the show, who works for Five Gyres. Five Gyres is the NGO from California that has been leading the plastic discussion since the very beginning. It was their founders who first sampled all 5 ocean gyres for plastic pollution. Lisa shares their latest research with Upstream's host, Brooking Gatewood. They tested biodegradable products in different environments, from a desert to the sea. Enjoy listening.
Welcome to the Indisposable Podcast, produced by Upstream. I'm your host, Brooking Gatewood. Thanks for joining for another episode celebrating solutions to plastic pollution.
Calling all reuse businesses, community groups, and activists. The Reusees returns this May, and applications are now open. Once again, we'll be presenting the annual Reuse Awards live at Green Biz's Circularity 24 conference in Chicago. The Reusees champions the heroes making reuse a reality for people across the US and Canada by uplifting their stories and providing them with meaningful support. This year, we're excited to offer more awards and bigger prizes. There will now be 3 Activist of the Year winners, as well as 3 Community of the Year winners, who will each receive a $2,500 award to support their work. And all Most Innovative Reuse Company finalists will all receive an all-access pass to attend and participate in Circularity 24. Applications are open from now through February 29th. Submit your online application today, or share your favorite reuse activist, community group, or business at thereusees.org. That's THEREUSIES.org.
Welcome back, everybody. Happy New Year. Today I'm talking with Dr. Lisa Erdl, Director of Science and Innovation at the Five Gyres Institute and a lead author of Five Gyres' recently released Better Alternatives 3.0 report. As a biologist and ecotoxicologist, Lisa's research investigates the sources, fate, and effects of microfibers on the environment. She has both published in leading scientific journals and works with policymakers and brands to help vet new technologies for reducing plastic pollution in our materials. Today, she's going to help us sort through what the latest science can tell us about the environmental impacts of different plastic substitutes. And so we'll jump right in. And Lisa, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Let's start with a couple of key terms that some of our listeners might have these distinctions and some might not. So one of the ones I know that shows up in your report is bio-based versus biodegradable plastic materials. So let's kick off with talking about the difference between those and any other terms we want to clarify before we jump into the report.
I'm so glad you're kicking it off with definitions because they're really important. There's a lot of greenwashing and confusion around these different definitions. There are bio-based materials, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all biodegradable. Bio-based just means that it's produced from renewable biomass. This can be things like cornstarch and sawdust and food waste. But when they're formed, they can turn into all different types of polymers. Some of those can be biodegradable, meaning that they'll break down, and others are a lot more stable in the environment and are more similar to traditional fossil fuel-based plastics. Essentially, the chemical structure can be made almost the same. But if it's biodegradable, it can be consumed by microorganisms, and the carbon is really returned to its natural state. Where there's also a bit of confusion around biodegradable is biodegradable, but where? Something might be technically biodegradable, but only in very specific conditions. So there's a lot of nuance around bioplastics and biodegradable materials.
Okay. And that piece you're talking about do things really degrade or not, is a big part of what this BA, as in Better Alternatives 3.0 report, is all about. So will you walk us through some of the key findings and the methods you guys use to get to the key findings?
We looked at 22 different products and packaging, including bioplastics and also traditional fossil fuel-based plastics. And we put them in 6 different environments: a desert in California, the ocean in California, a cold marine environment in Maine, a forest in Maine, and in the Everglades, and in the ocean in Florida. So we had a big range of different environmental conditions in the US. We did this because a lot of these products and packaging have claims of biodegradation. But as we know, there's a lot of differences in terms of temperature and microbial communities. We looked at how these 22 different items essentially fragmented and broke down over nearly a year and a half. So we had these products in different mesh bags. We put them in the environment and we'd check on them in regular intervals and weigh them and photograph them and see what was really, really happening to these materials, so we can have decisions around biodegradable and bioplastics be made based on science and real findings, and seeing how they perform in the environment to really vet some of these new material innovations.
Yeah. And I know that for those who've been in the movement for a long time, they might remember the original ban list, as we called the 1.0 version of this report. And then there was another list put out. I think that first one was in 2016. Then a couple years later, there was a ban list 2.0. And now this report is your third in the series. It's coming 4 or 5 years after the last one. So how does this connect with the work that you guys were doing in the prior reports? And is there anything that's distinct or new in what's in the 3.0 report?
In the prior studies that we did, we looked at marine and terrestrial environments. We didn't have as much of a range, but when we tested different materials, one thing that really stood out to us was how quickly PHA broke down. This was, as you mentioned, years ago. So there was very few items that were made out of PHA.
So for our listeners who aren't as familiar, what does PHA stand for? What does that term mean in the world of bioplastics?
PHA is a biomaterial that's synthesized by bacteria. So it's a polymer that's naturally occurring in the environment, but it can also be synthesized. So this is one of the bioplastics that are being considered for for these novel products and packaging. And when we did our study years ago, we had one PHA item. It was a PHA beach toy, and it degraded so much quicker than the other bioplastics that we tested. So we looked at this and said, is this a promising material? And it was really the thing that inspired us to do this larger study and look at some more of these alternative polymers, these new things that are starting to come on the market more. Things like PHA and other biomaterials like PHB. So we tested a range of different plastic types with some of these novel bioplastics that are starting to come onto the market more and more.
Got it. So some of the materials that you're studying here are relatively new in the ongoing field of innovation, if you will, around trying to create alternatives to plastic, and you guys are testing how helpful versus potentially harmful are some of these new alternatives.
Exactly. These new alternatives are, continuing to enter the market, and we wanted to make sure that there is adequate testing to understand what happens to these different items if they do get into the environment. What happens to them? How do they break down? What kind of persistence do they have? And another question: what are ultimately the effects?
So I know that the deepest answer is to invite listeners to go read the report for themselves, but can you give us sort of the executive summary version of what some of your big findings were about these different materials and which are better than others to consider as alternatives to plastic?
Yeah. A lot of the thin films that we tested, it was really surprising to us how quickly they actually broke down. The environment matters a great deal. In the warm, wet environments in Florida, for example, things broke down much, much more quickly than in the cold waters of Maine or even coastal California, where the water is relatively cooler. And the polymer matters too. PHA and PHB, some of these novel biomaterials started fragmenting much more quickly than PLA, polylactic acid, which is one of these older biomaterials that listeners may be more familiar with, since it is a bioplastic that's been around for so much longer. But we really found a lot of differences based on the polymer type, the type of environment that these items were in, and how products are designed. A biomaterial that is still quite thick, something like a fork, degrades at similar timeframes to something that is made from cellulose, something like bamboo or paper. So when we're designing these new items, the way that they're constructed really matters. And for example, the fork that we tested, that was PHA. The prongs of the fork started fragmenting quite quickly, but then the handle of the fork, which was much thicker, persisted similarly to the bamboo fork that we tested as a control. So when designers are starting to make these single-use items where there's a need for it. I don't think that we need to have these bioplastics for single-use packaging in every case, but where we do have them, the design matters, and having more spaces, having something like a honeycomb structure could help microbes access this material and break it down much more quickly. So the thickness matters too.
And something I know that a sort of another buzzword, if you will, that's in the report is this idea of feedstocks. So can you tell us a little bit about what are feedstock materials and which ones are more promising or less?
Yeah, there's a range of different feedstocks for bioplastics. One feedstock that's really well known for PLA, polylactic acid, is this is industrial farming bio feedstocks. So this is things like corn and wheat, and it can be agricultural waste as well. If we do a one-to-one replacement of all single-use plastics and replace them with bioplastics, there's a big need for agricultural land to feed that beast. But there's other feedstocks too that are really promising and novel and interesting. We've seen seaweed be used to make thin films. Growing seaweed in some cases can store carbon and help encourage biodiversity in areas when it's done properly and isn't harvested intensively. And other novel feedstocks, like companies that are looking to use waste methane from wastewater treatment plants and capture that methane and turn it into a biomaterial through microbes and using those sugars as a food source. So the feedstocks really matter. There have been calls for challenges of what happens if we have these big industrial farms used for feedstock, whether it's sugar cane or corn, and if we are just replacing all of our conventional plastics with bioplastics. We want to make sure we're not putting undue pressure on agricultural systems, for example.
Sounds like a similar problem that came up when ethanol came onto the market as an alternative to gasoline. And suddenly we had a major land management problem with all the land that was converted to cropland, and that's a ecological issue for habitat protection, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's the input side and the piece you just shared about the possible impacts of the different inputs and some of the more promising ones, like the seaweed example that you gave. And then there's sort of, I don't know if you would call this the output side, but thinking about infrastructure needs for bioplastics. I know we talk a lot on this show about how reuse requires new infrastructure. And it sounds like bioplastics do as well when it comes to appropriate composting to actually get these things to degrade. So I'm curious for your take on, what are some of the low-hanging fruit, this version might make sense examples versus, examples where the infrastructure needs are so high that we might as well focus on reuse infrastructure instead. I'd love to get your sense of the landscape in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly, reuse and refill requires redesigning our systems and having the right infrastructure to handle it. And refill and reuse are a great thing to strive for. But as we've seen, they can't work for everything or can't work for everything right now. We see certain cases where there aren't great systems for refill and reuse, thinking about thin film packaging for meats and cheeses. In a lot of cases, we don't have great systems for that yet. And some of these single use might be needed now. And to handle them properly, we'd want to see a system where these materials that can biodegrade and can biodegrade in composting systems actually enter those composting systems. We lack a lot of composting infrastructure in the U.S. Less than 10% of food scraps are composted, and there's a real need to up the amount of municipal composting infrastructure and to do the testing to see how these items go through various composting systems and see how they really break down and degrade. We were looking at what happens with these items in the environment, and to take these similar items and put them through the ringer and through a composting system, I think is a really important next step, because we know that some items don't break down in composting systems, but the ones that broke down quickly in our study in environmental conditions, which are typically not as easy to break down as these industrial composters or other types of composting systems. I think the low-hanging fruit is increasing the amount of composting we have, and also educating consumers and composters about what items can go through the composting systems and which ones should be avoided.
And then in terms of, I'm hearing from you that a big part of the focus of this report is for cases where reuse systems aren't an option, like the thin film on meat packaging is a really good example of that. What are your thoughts about things like the single-use foodware, which is one that a lot of the movement is focusing on shifting toward reuse? If you were to sort of your best sense of the cost benefit overall of the changes required to make, the bamboo forks viable versus the changes required to just switch to reuse systems, do you see one as more the easier next step than the other, or that they should be happening in parallel? Just curious for your bird's eye view on that issue that we're always debating in this space with the latest science that you're bringing to the table.
I think there's a lot of great innovations for foodware for refill and reuse. We have a lot of available alternatives where we can really move away from single use. Single use foodware, even if it's bamboo, can have these negative impacts. We've seen inputs of perfluorinated chemicals to give waterproofness, and there can be a lot of confusion of what type of material it's really made of. Something like a blue or a red straw is likely really hard to distinguish for composters from conventional plastics in a composting system. And we have a lot of reusables for those anyway. Where it could work are for closed systems, thinking about maybe compounds where there is a cafeteria and there's composting on site and everything is sort of staying within the same system, or for large events where refill and reuse has proven challenging because of the cost, because of the loss. And I could envision that single-use foodware could be used in those types of cases. But in a lot of examples, we come across really great options for refill and reuse, and that should really be prioritized.
Hmm. And then one more question for you about report findings. Which findings did you find particularly surprising that you weren't expecting something to degrade as well or as poorly, or any other kinds of surprises that might be interesting for our listeners to know about?
I was surprised that some of these biomaterials, like PHA and PHB, degraded in similar timeframes to these natural cellulosics. So the PHA fork, for example, it degraded even more quickly than the bamboo fork that we tested, and that was surprising to me. And so when we're thinking about these alternatives, these alternative materials, not necessarily for cutlery, we see a lot of innovation in that space where there's single-use foodware being developed from these novel materials, so they were easy to test. But I was surprised that it was so quick and really rivaled these natural materials like bamboo that we consider as biodegradable. And it was interesting to me to see that in some cases the PHA even surpassed how the bamboo performed in the environment. So that was a real kind of eye opener for me. But I'd like to see more alternative materials in other sectors of society, not just single-use foodware. It's where we've seen a lot of new developments and innovation. But thinking about what are the other sectors of society that could benefit from these materials in cases where there's loss to the environment and there's a real need for materials that will eventually break down. Whether it's fishing gear, crab traps, lobster traps, ropes and buoys that get lost, sometimes intentionally, but often unintentionally, lost to the environment, or cases where there's car tire dust that's shedding from the roads, can some of those synthetic polymers be replaced with biomaterials that will break down? I think there's a really long list and a need for alternative materials because we see so many emissions to the environment, and finding these different areas where we know that there is loss to the environment, and where we don't have good options for capture or for more durable materials. Could these bioplastics be an alternative?
Yeah, and it seems the way that your report is set up, it's visually very easy to go through. And I also had the similar impression that you spoke to of PHA doing surprisingly well across a number of materials in this, and as an example of a new material that might be a helpful innovation in our transition to a more reuse-based economy. So we've touched on a bunch of misconceptions and some of the key findings here. And our listeners are always interested in how they can get involved to help with these issues. So what are some of your takeaways for our listeners in terms of how to be involved in addressing misconceptions and communicating about this and taking action?
Yeah, I think that consumers should demand disclosure of what's going into their materials. We know that plastics are a really complex mixture of, there can be hundreds of polymers, thousands of additives, and often we don't know what's going into it. So I think listeners can demand of policymakers and the manufacturers to really know what is going into these materials, so they can make more informed decisions. Something that is PHA. Is it pure PHA? Has it been mixed with synthetic colorants or copolymers to give these plastics different properties? Are there additives in there? Many additives that are added to plastics, as your listeners know, can have these negative effects. They're persistent in the environment or show toxicity. And even these bioplastic polymers, even if the polymers themselves are non-toxic, they can still have additives and non-degradable plastics and still cause potential harm. So I think that as we, in some cases, transition away from fossil fuel-based plastics to these bioplastics, we need to demand these answers and have transparency around what's going into these materials to make sure that they don't cause harm. We've taken a subset of these samples that we looked at in the study of the 22 products and are testing for various additives, just so we have more information on what's actually going into these products and packaging, and can help understand what the effects are as these materials break down. We don't want to see a scenario where there are these persistent components that can cause toxicity, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's not covered as much in this report.
Yeah, it's really a next step for a deeper dive, and we're starting to look at that. So you can stay tuned for our next work on what happened, what we're finding with these materials.
Awesome. So that's the next step that you all are taking. And any other next steps our listeners might be able to take. So demanding accountability from brands in terms of what is in their products and materials. Anything else?
I think advocating for systems that really work. So if we're going to shift towards bioplastics, demanding that we have proper end of life for these materials, including sorting and the right infrastructure. And a lot of these decisions are being made by policymakers. So getting involved, voting, looking for advocacy alerts that we share in Five Gyres and through the coalitions that we're a part of, and making sure that there's the right system that's needed for some of these novel materials, because they show promise, but they're really important to the transition for reusables, but require some real, truth in advertising and the right systems, the right infrastructure to handle them.
Awesome. Anything I haven't asked you that you were hoping we would talk about?
Just thanks so much for the time, and stay tuned for our next research on these bioplastics. It's a really interesting area of research. There's a lot of innovation, but this new innovation requires scientific vetting before it's adopted in a really widespread way. So we hope to see more science to help inform decisions, so decisions can be based on facts.
Awesome. And, we didn't even at the beginning talk too much about who Five Gyres is, which was a assumption on my part that most listeners know. But let's do a quick, what does it mean to follow Five Gyres' work beyond? I know you guys do science, but you do a lot more. So the number 5, not spelled out, GYRES.org is your website. And is there anything else you want to tell us about your organization and the best ways for people to follow your work before we close out?
Yeah, best way to follow our work is through social media. We're on Instagram and X, and to follow our science that we publish. We're a small but mighty science-based organization that really helps empower action against the global health crisis of plastic pollution. I'm a scientist and I do science, but we also share what we do and what's happening in the scientific community through education and advocacy. And a lot of our work is really moving upstream. We started our work in the oceans to answer questions about plastic in the 5 subtropical gyres in the oceans. And we're now going upstream and vetting innovations, finding plastic pollution closer to the source to help inform solutions.
Yeah. And we've also had members of your team come and join us to talk about some of the coalition work you guys are involved in with Reusable LA and the Austin Reuse Coalition, Clean Seas, and others. So Five Gyres has long been a very central player in the U.S. movement against plastic pollution. So it's always a treat to have you guys on the show. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time, both speaking to me today, and I know you put in a lot of hard work into this report. So really appreciate your efforts so that we all have this really good information, and looking forward to hearing the next layer of research that comes out.
Thanks so much. It's like an onion. There's always more to learn.
Absolutely. The life of a scientist. All right. Well, thank you, Lisa, and have a good one.
Thank you.
And that's our show. If you like what you're hearing, help spread the word. Subscribe to the Indisposable Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Add a review, talk us up. Nobody spreads a message like you. The Indisposable Podcast is brought to you by Upstream, sparking innovative solutions to plastic pollution, envisioning a world without it, and empowering businesses, communities, and individuals to imagine and co-create this future with us. You can find resources mentioned on today's episode, as well as learn more about Upstream's work at www.upstreamsolutions.org. Follow us on social and join the movement. There's a better way than throwaway.